Did you ever hear a story that profoundly impacted your life? I'm talking about a sticky story, the kind that sort of tattooed your brain. You heard it and you never forgot it because it made such an impact upon your life. You know, that happened with me a number of years ago, and it's one of those stories that stuck because it helped me to really understand a very important thing in my own life, and that was how I learn. Now, the story itself wasn't about that, but I learned those lessons by the story. And today I want to share that with you in the hopes that perhaps it will also encourage you to understand something that maybe you've never really understood. And that is, we know that we learn, we begin doing that from the moment that we're born into this world. But how do we learn and why do we learn the way that we do? And today let's talk about that because I think it can be of help to you. My name is Glenn Plum, and I'm a lifelong creative communicator who has as my desire to help people experience success in their lives. Now, by success, what I mean is that their lives are characterized by freedom and fulfillment and fruitfulness. And I would ask you, is that the way that your life is? You know, I believe that people come to YouTube for a number of different reasons. Some come just to be entertained, and others come to gain information. But others come for the purpose of experiencing transformation. They look at their own lives and they know that there's some changes that they'd like to make. And they're looking for some hints that might help them along the way, that they might be able to lay hold of that would really bring about significant change within their lives. And that's what I want to be able to do in your life. So here's that story. There was a young man who was a senior in high school, and all of his life he had really had a desire to become a biologist. He had done a search of the available schools, and he finally found one that had a world-renowned biologist who was one of the professors there, and he decided that was the school that he would like to attend. He applied and was accepted. And he went to school that first year anticipating the opportunity to sit at the feet of this great teacher. And he signed up for the Introduction to Biology class that was to be taught by this particular professor. He looked forward to that first day of class, and he entered the room and sat among the other students who likewise were excited about the beginning of this new semester. And before long, the professor came through the door. He looked a lot like a person that you would expect to be a professor. He walked in the room and he was carrying a pan, and in that pan was a fish. He walked to the desk at the front of the room and laid that pan on the table. He surveyed the room and looked into the faces of the students that were there, and he said these words, "Study the fish." And with that, he turned and left the room. Well, the students sat there for a moment, rather bewildered, and began to realize he's not coming back. And finally, one of the students said, well, maybe we ought to go up and study the fish. And so one by one, they got up and went and circled the table that was there at the front. And as they looked down at the fish, one of the students said, I wonder what kind of fish it is. And someone who had some fishing background suggested that he thought he knew the kind of fish that it was. And then someone else said, well, I wonder how long that thing is. And because it was a science lab, they looked around and found a tape measure, and they were able to measure the length of that fish. And someone said, well, how much does it weigh? And they weighed the fish. And on they went, looking at one thing and then another thing and talking among themselves, studying the fish. Then at the end of that hour, left and looked forward to the next day where perhaps they would get into the meat of the matter and really begin to study the subject matter that they were going to be interested in. Well, the next day, as class began, the professor came in through the door again, and he was carrying that same pan, and in that pan was that same fish. And he laid it down on the table in front of the students, and he said, "Study the fish." The students sort of looked at one another out of the corner of their eyes and rolled their eyes a little bit, going, oh no, here we go again. The professor left, and soon they were again gathered around the table up in front, studying the fish. But this time, someone began to ask, I wonder why it has as many fins as it does, and what do those fins do? And someone was looking at the tail and the shape of the tail and realized that not all fish have the same shape of tail, and was wondering, I wonder why that particular fish has a tail shaped like that. And then someone else began to notice the way that the scales traced down through the fish and overlapped one another in an interesting way. And someone else noticed the iridescent colors that reflected off of the surface of the fish. And someone else lifted up the gills and looked inside to see what was there. And someone else mentioned the eyes and where the eye was placed on the fish. And they all wondered why it is found exactly there. And then the shape of the mouth, and on they went throughout the hour. And the hour ended, and they left. The next day, the professor came into the room, and this time he was not carrying the pan. He walked to the front of the room and began lecturing without really any mention of what had happened the previous 2 days. He simply allowed the students to think about that experience. One by one, they began to realize that it was one of the most profound learning lessons that they had ever experienced. And I believe that it can be that for us as well. Our takeaway is not going to be so much about the fish, but we're going to learn that there were things that they did in the process of that were the keys to their learning. And that was really what the exercise was all about anyway. So let's talk about those things. I'm going to suggest several things that at least were the lessons that I learned as I thought back about this particular story. The first thing is that we learn by focusing. That's very, very important, because the truth is that if we're not careful, we can have our minds so distracted by this and that and another thing that we never really get focused. We never get intent on any one thing. Now, the students that were there that day thought that their interest was biology, but it's a much more complicated issue than that, you see. It's one thing to say, well, I want to be a biologist, but someone might ask, well, what kind of a biologist do you want to be? For you see, under the category of biology goes zoology and botany and microbiology and ecology and genetics and neuroscience, biochemistry, marine biology, anatomy, and biotechnology, and probably even more than that. And the only way that a person can really grasp a subject matter is to begin to focus upon it. And one by one, those students were having to focus upon that fish in order to study it. And that would hold true throughout the rest of their lives. I've learned that lesson applies in my life in a lot of different ways. I know that when I go to museums, and I don't go very often, but when I do, I realize that I'm not going to be able to stop at everything that is on display there and read all the information that is posted about that particular item. I don't want to do that for two reasons. One, it takes too long. And second, after a while, all of it begins to go blurry. I'm no longer focused. But now I'm just taking in information at such a rate that I can't really do anything with it. And perhaps you've experienced that same kind of thing. So one of the lessons that we must embrace if we're going to understand how we learn is that it requires focus. Little babies do that as they're learning to talk. They study the mouth of a parent to see how the parent is forming words, and they study the sounds that they're listening to. They focus because they're wanting to somehow learn to communicate with that face that they're looking at. Another thing I realized as I reflected back on that is that we really do learn by layering our learning. This is something that people who are educators understand is an important part of the process of learning. And what I mean by that is that we don't learn everything all at once, but we layer our learning. Someone suggested that the way that you begin is with just general concepts, and you get a first layer, some general information. It's the gathering phase of learning. But then you go a little deeper as you study it more, and at this level, you're evaluating now. Is this important? Is this a peripheral part of the process? And where does it fit into the overall picture of what I'm learning? And then you go deeper than that, and that has to do with application. So what do I do with this that I'm learning? And you begin to plug it into different places in your life. I know that certainly has been true of my life. One of the things that I've enjoyed throughout my life is painting. And in the process of that, I realized that I can't learn it all in one day. I've painted for many, many years, and I've learned a lot over time. I've layered the learning. and I began to gather the basic concepts of how to paint and how to draw. But then beyond that, I began to evaluate what works and what doesn't work. And then, so what do I do with that? And what is going to be a good fit for me in the artwork that I do? A third thing that we could observe in this process of how we learn is that we learn by collaborating. Remember how those students in that story gathered around the table and they began talking to one another, and one person was saying, well, what about this? And someone else said, well, what about that? And they were asking questions and they were sharing information back and forth. And it was part of the way that they were learning. For a number of years, I taught at a university. I was the scenic designer for the theater department that was there. One of the things we always did as we were preparing for a production was that we would get together and have a meeting of all the people that were going to be instrumental in seeing that it was produced. That would include the director and the assistant director. It would include the costumer and other people that were responsible for making sure that the show was going to be pulled off. And we would get together and we would collaborate. And we would talk about the set and what kind of set was going to be needed, what period of time were we going to be reflecting, and what style of production was it going to be. I had to keep in mind that I needed to gather this information in order so that I could fulfill the desire of the director who was guiding the whole process. But it was such an enjoyable time being able to collaborate with one another, and maybe you've experienced that same kind of thing before. Collaboration can take place in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it happens just by watching a video on YouTube, just like you're doing right now. Whether you understand it or not, we're really having a conversation back and forth. I know I'm talking to real people on the other side of this camera. And whereas I may not be hearing your comments one way or the other, you're hearing me and you're processing it. And one of the things that I'm going to ask at the end of this video is that you give me some feedback. Let's really make this a dialogue where we gain from one another in the process of it. Now, the fourth way that I would suggest that we learn is by connecting. And what I mean by that is that we learn to take one subject that we get a certain understanding of and connect it to other things in our lives where we find parallels or applications. It's the truth that that fish was really not what that whole exercise was about. And I doubt that those students, and certainly not us, are going to be talking with many people about a fish. But you see, it wasn't about the fish. It was about the process by which we learn. And those are the takeaways that we can apply in other areas of our life. We can say, okay, I learned this through that story, and now I'm going to apply it in an area of interest that I have over here. And that's the way that we're going to grow to achieve anything in our lives. Now, those are the 4 points that I wanted to share with you about how we learn. My real desire is transformation. And therefore, I'm interested in knowing, how is this going to help you live your life in a better way? Is there any one takeaway that you're going to say, yeah, I'll carry that beyond having just watched this video? If it's been helpful to you, then I'm going to ask you to help me a little bit, if you would. Would you take a moment and like this video if you've liked it? And also, if you'd be willing to do that thing that they talk about in terms of subscribing to this channel. Another thing that I mentioned a moment ago is that I need your comments. I want you to leave them, and I'm going to read every one that you give, and I'll try to respond to as many of them as I can. But the point is that I want to get better. I better get better, and your feedback is going to help me. What worked? What didn't work? And how can I do this in a way that's going to be more meaningful to you? Because I really want it to be that for you. And then, if you found it of value, then would you be willing to share this video with someone else? Let them know, I watched this video and I found it to be helpful, and you might find it to be interesting as well. Week by week, I'm going to be showing up here real regularly, sharing lessons that I'm going to be drawing from all sorts of different avenues of interest in my own life. I've found that life is infinitely interesting, and we're never going to run out of things that we can talk about that can be great places for us to expand our lives and see us transformed from the inside out till we really are embracing that successful life that I mentioned earlier, that life characterized by freedom and fulfillment and fruitfulness. And so I'll look forward to you joining me week by week. My name is Glenn Plum. Thanks for joining us today.